Michelle?
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose,
Rose?
and today we're going to talk about hypotheticals and probabilities. We were talking about that the other day around the house and the difference between them and how that can relate to the subject of fear and wisdom and why it's important to tell the difference between hypotheticals and probabilities and how that can be a very useful distinction for thinking, mental model, and things like that.
Yeah. I think it's great because it gets into the weeds of facing fears. I did that little Spotify recording on that topic, and
Yeah.
I think often it's been something I've learned a lot from you, Daniel, too, on you know uh, fear and facing fear. What you fear is what comes onto you. I remember you saying that to me years ago, and I was like so struck by the oddity of it, the way like it sounded. I mean, I understood it generally, especially because of like scripture. You think about like in First John where it says like the one who fears is not made perfect in love, things like that, and fear has to do with punishment, da da da. So that made sense, but I also like it. Just it's taken it it's taken many years to like marinate in what that really means, and even more effort I think to really live that out. Because it's not easy to do, but it's important. It's necessary. Um, so anyways, the point of the matter is, though I started to see it kind of like quickly, right, when you start to realize, okay, whatever I'm, for example, okay, if you fear death, right, then you end up not living fully. So you're
Right.
kind of
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
sort of a living dead person already,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So what you fear is what comes onto you. Simple example, but I think it works. And anyways, the point of the matter is with hypotheticals and probability, why I found that helpful when we were talking is because it's sometimes there's a way in which sometimes wanting it is important to face a fear, to do the thing you're afraid to do, but also you do have to be sensible, right? This is like where the fear wisdom thing comes in, right? When you take probabilities into consideration, maybe it's not time to face your fear because in a way maybe there's actually some sort of adjacent fear that you're still not really facing
Yeah.
in trying to face the fear that is related to that fear.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let me try to give a more concrete example for those listening. It's um well, yeah, so if you think about it in terms of, well, maybe I should do this thing because I'm afraid to say yes to some invitation or something like this, and I should just do it. Now most people think that doesn't sound too hard, but when you have more responsibilities or you're mothering or whatever, like it does require relying on other people sometimes to say yes to stuff, and so you could feel that way, but at the same time there could be an adjacent fear of like, well, if I say no to this, what if the person I'm saying no to doesn't understand, or they're upset, or what if I'm this is an opportunity that in that particularity that I may not have again, so I in that way, in that same exact way, or timing. So those are kind of fears that are adjacent to the fear that kind of starts the thought process. And so if you take probabilities into consideration and hypotheticals, I mean, I think when it comes to hypotheticals, more or less, you almost always want to face those fears because those are usually the things that are just like literally just random
In
what
your
ifs,
head. Yeah.
possibly paranoid what ifs that you should just go ahead and face, right? And, again, go on and do the thing you're afraid to do. However, being mindful of probabilistic things is not to be afraid.
No.
Like to be mindful and to make a decision that is both facing fear but also being very realistic with probability is not to leave yourself. You could think, well, I'm just still being afraid, like I'm saying no, for example, in that consideration, because of various factors that sometimes are often just things out of our control that we have to take into consideration, right? So it's tricky though, because the mind does this weird oscillation, I think, between wanting to face the fear and not wanting to face the fear, thinking you're facing the fear, thinking you're not facing the fear, and then you just sort of are in this pendulum swing or little hamster wheel, versus really trying to think about, okay, I have to make both a facing fear decision and a wise decision.
Yeah.
And so, probabilities I think are helpful because they're necessary because, and they're not just escaping the facing fear, because you do want to also make sensible decisions. But last point, then I'll hand it to you. What's challenging about that, though, is that everybody's going to assess probability differently.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not always as easy to feel certain that my probabilistic calculation is accurate and true and isn't just me being fearful to say yes, for example.
Yeah, well, that's where you got to work on self-confidence, standing for yourself, your own ability, choices, etc., so forth. Yeah, I mean, if you say, what if I'm in a car wreck and it's icy outside, then there's a higher probability you will be in a car wreck. So but if you say, what if I'm in a car wreck and the environment is no different than ever, it's sunny outside.
Right.
Well, the probability of being in a car wreck is no higher than any other time of driving a car. So are you saying you're not going to drive? And,
exactly.
So basically a hypothetical falls back on a fundamental. Like, if you're going to start just saying, well, what if I'm in a car wreck in any and all circumstance? Well, then you're asking the fundamental question of if you should drive. And usually a fear you need to face is something that would make you withdraw from the fundamental or throw away the fundamental, which means you would be a devolution in your life. You'd be a devolution, right? You would lose something. And also, too, it would suggest you don't have capacity. Like, you don't have the capacity to drive a car. You're too weak to drive a car. You're too incapable, right? So a hypothetical leads to a dismissal of a fundamental that leads to a dismissal of a fundamental of you. Or it says something fundamental about you, right? So there's a kind of fallback. But if it's icy outside, and if I say what it's in a car wreck, you can be the greatest driver on planet Earth and would have a likely car wreck under certain weather conditions, right? Like, to acknowledge you could be in a car wreck when it's snowy outside is not at all a devolution of your capacity or character. It's an acknowledgement of human finitude, an acknowledgement of limitation that is simply being human, not a devolution. Like, humans can't fly. Like, we simply can't fly. So to acknowledge that humans can't fly is not a downgrade of you or me, right? Likewise, cars don't work good in ice. They don't drive well in ice. So to acknowledge that you could be in a car wreck when there's ice is simply an acknowledgement of the facticity of the object, right? So you don't have to dismiss the fundamental. To not drive during ice does not suggest you shouldn't drive at all. It's bound to the situation. So another thing that the hypothetical probability difference does is hypotheticals, that's why hypotheticals feel like falling. They feel like they never end, because they won't end until you dismiss the fundamental. They're always going to regress to a fundamental. Whereas a probability is contained, because it's situational. So one of the, when you consider a probability, you don't go crazy, because you even subconsciously feel the binding of it. You're considering the entire situation. So one of the other characteristics that can help the distinction between probability and hypothetical is hypotheticals feel like they're falling.
Boundless.
They feel boundless because they are boundless because they're based on the fundamental. Until the fundamental is dismissed, they cannot be bind. So hypotheticals want to trick you to dismiss the fundamental, to never drive again, or to never see your friend again, right? Like, if you say, what if my friend yells at me? Well, do they have a bad day at work? Then there's a higher probability they're going to yell at you, right? But it's situational. But if they didn't have a bad day of work, it's just a random encounter, well, then that's unbound. That's a hypothetical, and basically that would lead you to never talking to the person, right? So there's something also, and I'll get back to you, there's also something about the distinction between fear and wisdom that can be identified, which I think the mental model of probability versus hypothetical can help with. But another characteristic is the feeling of the thoughts just keep falling back. And if you feel a movement of thought, even irregardless of what the thoughts are, the very experience of a certain movement of thought means you're dealing with fear. Like, if it just keeps falling back into another thing, or another and another, and the chain doesn't feel like it ends, it's a fear. And another way to think about fear threatens fundamentals. Fears always threaten fundamentals. They always are going to work you back to some fundamental thing to dismiss, like never loving, or never driving, or never trying, or never experimenting. That's the only way to address the fear, is to never. Fear leads to a never. Where a probability is actually a mapping out of what you need to do to continue. Like if you're in a car, like if you drive during ice and you wreck your car, you won't be able to drive your car again. So there's a way in which probabilities are also affirmative, mapping territory to determine how to keep walking the territory, where hypotheticals are ever negative to make you throw away the map and stop walking entirely. So there's also a different experience of the thought itself that helps one identify if they're dealing with hypothetical or probability.
Yeah, that is helpful. I hadn't thought about it like that in terms of hypothetical relating to never. I mean, I think that what's helpful about that is to realize that is a logical end of such thinking. And you have to kind of really look at yourself square in the face and say, well, okay. Because I think
an unbound thought can only be stopped by the removal of the root of the thought. So it has to fall to a fundamental to stop, right?
I think the tricky thing is, because I'll be honest, sometimes the headspace can just over the years, and I there would be certain periods where I may struggle with it more than other times, but the hypotheticals are very sticky.
Very sticky.
Right?
Because they're unbound.
Because you can always say, well, maybe if I do just never,
they're unbound.
I can prevent that, right?
Yeah.
But then you think to yourself, but are you really never gonna?
And it's actually true. Like that's the key. It's actually true. Like if you never drove again, you wouldn't be in a car wreck. So that's why hypotheticals stay afloat, because they actually, in suggesting a dismissal of the fundamental, are true.
Right, and that's why I think they can have so much power psychologically.
Yeah, but because it's true that if you curled up in a ball, you never get hurt. Like, it is true that if you don't take risk, nothing bad will happen. But that also means you don't live.
Exactly. And I think being, because, there can be a fragility to, even in facing fear. I mean, and there's a lot of language around this idea of, like, you do something. Somebody who's brave isn't necessarily not scared, right? They just do it anyway, even though they feel scared, right? That's
if they weren't scared, in a sense, they wouldn't be brave,
right. But there should also be, in a sense, I want to say, realizing what you were saying about the neverness, or like the logical end would be to never drive, for example, can help actually stabilize a confidence in moving forward with facing fears and becoming more like it. In some ways, I want to say that, like, you don't want to kind of feel like you're going back to square one every single time. Right. You have to do the thing that might require you to, like every time you drive, right? Or whatever it is. Now, it's weird. Our brains sort of, we don't realize it, but we kind of highlight certain things over other things. Yeah. Which, in a nonsensible way, like statistically, it's not even rational, right? Like if you look at statistically, how it starts to realize, you start to realize that it sort of shows you the good thing about fears in a way. I mean, just because they're inevitable as humans, is they show us our values, right? They show us the things that we tend to focus on. And what we seem to be more concerned with, even though there's like this very much reasonable thing to be concerned about over here, but we don't even think about it.
Well, that makes a good point, because that fear is connected to value, which also suggests why the truth of the hypothetical is dangerous, because it would mean you give up the value. Like, because you're not afraid anymore, you're not facing the fear, but that means you're also not acknowledging the value. So you're going to be giving up a value.
I don't know, though. Would it be giving up a value? Because in a sense, you're like, I'm ultra fortifying it, because I'm just never going to take that risk with these things that or whatever it is. That's this thing that I'm so unwilling to like take any risk.
Well,
with.
you can't have value without risk, and you would certainly be giving up the value of movement, of being able to see people, of relating, of going places, and furthermore, you'd be giving up your valuation of yourself as capable of doing those things.
Yeah. And passing on that capacity, right? Like to anyone you encounter, your children, or future generations. I mean, in a sense, like there is something quite necessary about doing it yourself so that you can embody that which you hope to, share, right? Or that, I mean, this is why people often become more brave when they see bravery, right?
Yes.
Like they see it and they're like, wait a second, it can be done. If they can do it, maybe I can do it too, this kind of idea. But it is interesting how much it seems like we're driven a lot more by like our narratives about things than about just actual statistical fears,
Humans are absolutely more narrative driven.
Yeah, 100%. But anyways, so yeah, getting back to this idea of fortifying yourself so that you don't have to start back at square one every single time, because there's going to be a fragility to it. You're like holding your breath every single time, In a sense, like, is that bravery? I don't know. I mean, maybe, it depends on what we're talking about, right? But you may not be making the necessary progress if you don't realize the logical end of what your fear is kind of keeping you held to, right? Because if you say, okay, well, I either accept I do the never thing, right, the curl up in the ball thing, or I say I'm going to have this element of cultivating trust to do that which I am afraid of, and realize that it is necessary, because the alternative is the end point of the logical, is the logical end of allowing that hypothetical to dictate, right? And then ultimately that hypothetical is dictating more than life itself, more than love itself, more than
Well, you can't artificially create situations in which you're brave. Bravery has to surprise you. If you say, well, I'm going to intentionally create some sort of VR headset that's going to make me like face something scary or something, or get amnesia, or actually not develop capacity precisely so that I'm afraid, so that I'm brave, well, then it's separated from the true, it's contrived, and it's not connected to progress, right? So like bravery has to be a cultivation of virtue, and bravery, like facing fears as an end of itself, artificially constructed, would not be leading you to the beautiful, the good, and the true, right? Yeah. Because the only reason you face fears is for the thing through it, right? Not so you see like a good or true or the beautiful across the fear, or that it's keeping you from, and that's why you're facing it, right? Like you can't make a virtue out of it as its own thing, because the potential substance of virtue through facing fear is something, well, I would say ultimately the beautiful, right? So it can't be in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know.
And that's kind of like why asking, am I facing fear or not, alone may not help you with the hypothetical probability distinction.
No.
Right?
No.
Because, you could frame it as both, right? Mm-hmm. But the whole reason you would be asking about a probability is because you're already set to do something. You're already set to consider. It's framed in an action. Like if you're considering to drive and you're trying to genuinely figure out if you can or not, you're considering your probabilities of achieving the goal, right? But you'll notice that the hypothetical, which ultimately leads to should I drive at all, is independent of a goal. It's independent. It's the prior question before you take on any goal, right? And so that's another reason why it's dangerous to fall into hypotheticals, because it's creating an obstacle that if in the future a goal of the beautiful were to arise, it would be automatically out of hand, because you've created a goal that you can't pass and not letting yourself drive at all, right? So to consider a probability is always towards something. It's always beyond just the thing itself. So facing fear it's towards something. Otherwise, you're just like to face a hypothetical, or to even consider a hypothetical. Because here's another thing. There's two sides of this. You could follow the hypothetical into madness and curl up into a ball, or you could face every hypothetical situation that comes up and tell yourself you're facing fear, because you're facing every hypothetical. Well, the hypothetical was unlikely in the first place. It actually was not likely to occur. So you're really just fighting with phantasms. You're not really facing fears, you're facing hypotheticals in a funny way. It's not really a fear. A fear has a certain fear is along the way. There's a certain along the wayness to fear.
No, I think that's a good point. I do think that, fear, what is it, like Lacan says about, like, anxiety being the only, like, accurate...
Well, and let me not to interrupt. I mean, when I say facing fear, I mean actually doing the hypothetical. Like if you're like, wow, if I were to drive a car, I could be in a wreck, so let me get in my car right now and go drive somewhere to face that fear, right? Just out of the blue because that fear hits you, right? Like that. Well, then 5 minutes later, you have a new hypothetical about the oven exploding or something. Mm-hmm. So just one hypothetical would lead to the next on an endless chain, and actually it would create paranoia.
Yes. No. I think that's very fair and very good, and also is why it's not it's a complexification of the facing fears, because you also do. You won't be able to also discern what you should actually do without the wisdom part of it, right? Which is the what are the probabilities, and sure, somebody else might be like, nah, like they might just sort of brush it off, right? But for you think, I'm not sure I'm going. This is still ringing in my head as a probability, so I am not just going to ignore it just because somebody else would, right? But like I was saying about Lacan and anxiety, like there's something about fear to me though that feels very clear.
Yeah.
Like you kind of wish it weren't, and you avoid it, and you sort of pretend it's not there, or that you don't have that particular, that you're not afraid to do a particular thing or whatever. But I don't know, there's just something so it's just there. It's like that. It can feel, depending on what it is in particular, but often it's like, it's just that thing, that you need to do. Now, there are times when it's a little less clear, I think that there are times when it's very obvious like that, like almost an elephant in the room, but there are times when it's a little bit more like, oh, I seem to struggle with whatever it is, making a decision on plans, for example, okay? I seem to struggle with that because I seem to just want almost somebody else to make the decision for me, basically. That is where I think it's kind of like, it's related to fear, but it's also you having to take responsibility, which may also mean you have to do this kind of calculations between how much am I being dictated by hypotheticals, which, like you said, are usually low in probability anyway, or the how much am I being dictated by that. And it's almost like how much am I realistically taking probabilities into consideration? That should be, because I'm the adult, to have to really think that through.
Yeah.
And, so I guess what I mean to say though, is there is something though that I feel keeps the reason why the topic can still feel, how do I say this? Though I do see the chance for somebody becoming paranoid in their slaying of all their hypotheticals, right? Like, I'm going to battle my hypotheticals.
Yeah. Well,
I do wonder if there's something though that's quite evident to in one's own particularity of what they know they fear, and having to sort of give yourself opportunity to face that, not out of just sort of this random, well, that means today I'm gonna use the oven and turn it off and leave the house on just randomly for no reason, just to test myself. But there are ways in which if you never sort of make yourself do certain things, you may just never do it because you're like, it's just easier not to. It's just more comfortable not to do the thing.
Well, so there's a few things. So there might be a distinction between paranoia, hypothetical, and probability. And paranoia might be phantasms or contrived. So there's a third layer here, which seems to be along the gradient, that maybe hypothetical can fall into, where it's actually now defining your entire life. Because hypothetical, to kind of, hypothetical though, it actually does, to walk back what I was saying, hypothetical seems to be on a goal path. It is on a goal path, but a form of hypothetical that is not is the paranoid. where you're just like, every moment is defined by hypotheticals that are uncontrollable, which is a more extreme form of hypothetical, but maybe a term might be reserved for the term paranoia. You see, the reason I guess, though, the paranoia case study is important is because that would suggest a world of facing fears where you're almost facing fear in a contrived way that actually just doesn't ever get to the root of the paranoia, which is you are imagining things. Like if you just face every imagination and never get to the root of none of this is real, then you could face the fears of those imaginations all day long. And if they never lead you back to seeing this kind of tendency to imagine things indefinitely, then it won't necessarily fix things, right? Because really it's not, you're facing phantasms, which is kind of interesting because a hypothetical is a phantasm, but it's one that seems more plausible. There's a certain plausibility that grows. Like, because when you're driving a car, you can be in a wreck, right? You are, to get to the destination, you have to drive a car, right? And so there is a live possibility you could be in a wreck, right? Whereas if you're just in the kitchen cooking dinner and the thought enters your mind, what if I was in a car wreck? Because a lot of times people who are nervous, their mind is just almost uncontrollable. You would not want to then just go out, get in the car and drive somewhere to face that thought that entered your mind, right? Because then you're at the mercy of your uncontrollable thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I think in that respect, there are some things that can be faced and slayed, if you want to say it that way, like, or to think about it that way. The slaying the dragon of the paranoia that just happens in your mind.
Yeah.
Truly. Like it's a kind of, sure, it might take, you could say.
Yeah, what you need to do then is just say, I'm being paranoid.
Yeah, I'm being paranoid.
Yeah, and control your mind.
Right. I do think that the tricky thing is that, like you said, when we move into the hypothetical, what's hard about that space is that in a great big world, like unfortunately, there's you always want to tell yourself that the fact that it could happen once, even, it's like that's enough fodder for the mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
To think, well, okay, yeah, we could say there's a low probability or it's just a hypothetical, but like that is something that like
it's possible.
It's a possibility. But see, a possibility is not a probability. It's not. It's
that's
probably
another way
a low
to word
probability.
It. Yeah, a hypothetical is possible, but it's not probable.
Exactly. But and so I think it's really having to kind of work at, and that's where I think the actions may come into place where, it means that when you have to go to the grocery store, you drive there. Yep. If we're talking about this fear of like driving or getting in a car wreck or something like that, right? Like you say, yeah, it's possible, but it's not probable on a day where there's no ice, no bad inclement weather. It's I'm not tired. You know what I mean? Like, and then you say, or you just starve, right, or whatever. I mean, unless you're really good at gathering and hunting or whatever. But so yeah, I think that's interesting. I do think that's a fair point, though, that there seems to be this ability and importance of the mind space doing the work itself. Otherwise, you may not have good discernment. You may always think that an action is completely necessary to face it, when really it may not necessarily require action. It may require, like you said, kind of calling it out as this is paranoia.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's interesting because fear seems to collapse the distinction between the possible and the probable, where you can't tell the difference anymore.
100%.
And so there's a confusion in that. And so wisdom somehow maintains the distinction between the probable and the possible.
Yes.
And maybe the paranoid is where they're controlled by the possible. Like completely. Like they're like a dog on a leash pulled around by the possible. So where the hypothetical, it's not where you're controlled like a dog on a leash by the hypothetical. There's a little bit of agency, but the agency feels weak.
Yeah.
In fact, I almost want to say in the paranoid, Maybe there's a sense in which you have hyper agency because you're like, you know everything you need to do. Just anything that pops into your head, do it, right? And so there's this weird way in which the saturation at the complete loss of agency, because you're just being pulled around by the possible constantly, might feel like supreme agency because you always know what to do. So
what are you talking about in regards to paranoia?
Yeah, to the paranoia.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think that's a great point, and often why, oddly, as much as one can feel out of control regarding paranoia, they're very much in control.
Yes.
Because they decide, right?
Yes.
They just decide, right? It's the whole idea of like curling up in the fetal position or never going, it's like, yeah, you're right, great. You've got your it's true, right? You won't ever get hurt if you just never take risks, never engage with other humans, never go out into the world, whatever. And so there's this, like you said, there's a supreme agency that actually exists in that space, all while you're also the dog on the leash, right? Just constantly being like...
Well, it's like many people with conspiracy theories feel like they have the insider knowledge, they feel like they're... Yeah, sure, they think there's a great conspiracy, but there's a kind of agency you have in following it and knowing it. So it's interesting how the paranoid, if we use that term, leads to a certain... You're controlled by everything possible, but it feels like extreme agency. Whereas the hypothetical, when you're concerned about the hypothetical, there's a certain suspension of agency, because what can I do if this is possible, right? So maybe the hypothetical is where there's a collapse between the probable and the possible, but there's still a sense of agency. Whereas in the paranoid, it's almost so lost that you have no agency, but you also don't even have the agency to tell that you don't have agency. So,
which gives you the supreme agency?
Yes, but it's an illusionary supreme agency.
And typically people don't feel it to be that.
In the paranoid? Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of people in like conspiracies or stuff do feel empowered. They feel like they have the insider knowledge. Mm-hmm. But also,
but you're saying, but practically they're not.
No.
It's a complete like forfeiting of that.
No, because they're just having to follow the thought. Mm-hmm. They just have to follow the line of thought, right? Whereas it's interesting because in the hypothetical, in the paranoid we might say, as a tentative schema, in the paranoid there's a collapse of the possible and the probable with a complete loss of agency that is covered by a sense of agency.
Yeah, perfect.
Where in the hypothetical, there's a collapse of the probable and the possible, but there's still a sense of agency that actually feels like impetus. Your agency feels weak, but that's actually the feeling of agency, because agency is, in a sense, weak. It doesn't control much.
Impotent?
Weak.
Yeah.
It's kind of weak.
Yeah.
The very fact you have agency is evident in the feeling of its weakness.
Yeah.
Which is paradoxical. Mm-hmm. But actually there's a way in which agency is weak, because you don't control the world, you don't control the majority of factors. You can control just your causal chain, per se, but you can't control everything else.
Right.
So it's interesting because in the hypothetical there's a collapse of the possible and the probable, but still a presence of agency. But that agency comes across as weak, we might say. Mm-hmm. Where in the probable, you maintain the distinction between the probable and the possible, obviously. And it brings with it a sense of agency that's in control. It's able to tell the difference between the possible and the probable. So there seems to be some sort of role of the sense of empowerment also in this.
Can you give that breakdown for probability category one more time?
Because in the probable, you can tell the difference between the possible and the probable.
Yes.
And you also automatically have agency because you can tell the difference between the probable and the possible. And there's agency because you can assess probability. Mm-hmm. So there's something about agency that is emerging into its fullness as you move from the paranoid to the hypothetical to the probable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. You kind of said something like about agency inherently kind of feeling weak.
Yeah.
Would that still apply to the probability category?
Yes, there is a sense of weakness because you have to assess the probabilities. Like, you can't change things directly. You can't snap your fingers and have the world be a certain way. Right. But it's interesting because it's like you've mastered the weakness. Mm-hmm. You've come to own the weakness and get good at it. You've come to kind of accept the fact that we can't have certainty, only probability.
Right.
But you've learned to work with that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's almost like Easter, and you've used weakness as a strength in a way.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Yeah. No, I think that's all very good. And I think that's a great breakdown.
But this would suggest that to tell the difference between these things, you need to cultivate agency first.
Yeah.
But then, of course, how do you cultivate agency without making choices? And how do you make choices if you can't tell the difference between the paranoid, the hypothetical, and the probable?
I think, too, what's interesting is that we how do I put this? It may be tempting to think about it in terms of one of those categories.
Sure.
Because, like, for example, in some ways, it could just be simpler to say, well, I'm fighting my hypothetical, so I'm going to just do the thing, right? But then you're not really taking into consideration probability. Or not taking responsibility that you are taking that assessment of probability into consideration. Like I said before, the agency thing is interesting, and I think you're right about this cultivation of agency, because nobody can get it, nobody can give it to you, nobody can because the thing is, if you, I don't know, there is a real nakedness with agency. I think that's why you said it can be quite weak, right? There's a sense of like, and yet that can be its very strength.
Yeah.
But the point of the matter is that, and maybe it can also just come from having to be the only one that's saying, yes, this probability is going to be the thing that I take as a factor or a considerable factor, knowing very well that somebody may make a different probability assessment, and still sticking with that, and feeling like that is your own agency. Because another thing is too, you're like, well, maybe I'm just doing that because I know, am I just absorbing constantly like what is in my periphery of their probability assessments, and I'm just sort of saying now, well, I'll just leave it in one camp or the other, versus be like, wait, how much am I really doing the and thing between the hypothetical and the probabilistic?
Because
for example, really last thing, if you say something like, okay, I'm taking probabilities into consideration, but there's still a part of you that's like, well, but maybe I'm just being afraid to, maybe I'm still being afraid to say yes or something like that. But you also know that in your heart of hearts, like, you are kind of, you are sort of reluctant to say yes because that's out of your comfort zone. So what that person finds themselves in that situation, I don't know, maybe it just comes down to the radical agency of deciding. You just choose that is your choice.
Well, I think ultimately there is some sort of absolute choice at the heart of this, because it's a chicken or egg problem. Yeah. Because 100%. How do you get the agency before you can tell the difference between, paranoid, hypothetical, and probability?
Right.
Well, it's almost like you have to make choices before you can, and train the agency. Because otherwise you're waiting for knowledge before action. You have the great problem in philosophy of the knowledge action split. So there's a few things. There's also something here where are you acting to prove yourself? You're trying to prove yourself to other people. That doesn't seem good, because you're not really doing it, in that sense, you're not doing it to face fear. You're doing it to not be seen as fearful. And that sounds the same, but there also can be, it's actually facing fear motivated by a fear. Because you're afraid of how people see you. Sure. You're afraid of what people think, and that's why you're facing the fear. Versus, and then that's just fear facing fear, versus doing it from a kind of absolute standpoint. It seems like when you face a fear, it has to be from a solid ground. Otherwise, it's just it's fear facing fear as if fear is being overcome, but it's just fear trading fears per se, right? So the moment we start worrying about other people's probabilities, well, then there's a fear motivating our facing a fear.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
So that seems to be an issue. There's also something here where perhaps one trains step by step, in the sense of first you start with learning not to be paranoid. And you start with the small things of, like, if like OCD, like, if I don't pick up this cup,
you check the oven, don't like go check it 15 more times.
Or if I don't pick up this cup, the world will end. Like obsessive compulsive disorder, getting to the place where, no, I'm not going to pick up this cup and the world won't end. There's a way in which that's a real triumph at the time, right? Now, as you get older, if you've overcome OCD when you were 12, that ceases to be a triumph, right? So maybe the first time when you move out of paranoia, it's a triumph. And maybe you do have to face some of the, usually in paranoia, it's if I don't do the thing, something bad will happen.
Yeah.
So there's also, I'm afraid that I'll be in a wreck if I drive a car, so let me go drive a car, or else something bad will happen. You could actually kind of frame it in an OCD way, right? Where you're just making yourself do obstacles to prove yourself, but actually that supposed facing of fear is a certain OCD, right? Really the thing to say is, look, I'm not going to go get in a car and drive around, but next time it's time to drive, I will.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems to be the proper way to address the paranoid, where you don't make yourself jump through hoops, but you also make a certain commitment to yourself that when the thing arises, you'll face it.
Right.
In the hypothetical, there's a way where basically hypotheticals are things you should always face. Like, that seems to be the heuristic, right? Like, if you're coming up with a million scenarios that are going to make you destroy the fundamental, then you need to do the thing. That you're coming up with hypotheticals. So hypotheticals seem to be something you face. Paranoia seems to be things you make a commitment against.
Yeah.
So that this is where I guess what I'm thinking. Paranoia you make commitments against. Hypotheticals you face. Probabilities you assess.
Right. What if you face... I have no qualms with the paranoid category. With the hypothetical, I think you're quite right. But what if your hypothetical is, I should face that, because that's obviously a hypothetical. But probabilistically, there's something that's not related to that hypothetical, but it's just some other factor that is going to mean
Probabilities, I guess I want to say, I
see what I'm saying?
yes,
It's
probabilities trump facing a hypothetical. Like, if it's probable that you'll be in a car wreck, then even if there's a hypothetical that you need to face at some point in your life, at this exact moment where the probability is that this is not a good time to do that thing, then this is not the time to face that hypothetical.
Right.
Because of whatever the probability assessment is, right? So there's something also where maybe that's part of the mental model where, for me, the probability comes first before you ask the question. Like, if you say, it's probable, please.
Well, yeah, I just had a thought where I've already brought this up where we oscillate so much, but this is where there's kind of this human reaction of like, but I don't care about the probability.
Yeah.
I don't care about the probability because I'm finally willing to face my hypothetical.
Yeah.
And so I don't care about the probability because I just want to go on and, I'm finally willing to do the thing that I'm afraid to do. So let me just do it.
But I think you're actually getting at something very interesting. So let's say you're afraid that if you go on a trip, you'll be hurt. Okay. And it's a hypothetical. And then one day it's snowing. And there's an opportunity to go on a trip. And you say, well, this is it. I'm going to face that hypothetical. Right? There's something really weird where I do find for some reason the brain is willing to face hypotheticals when probabilities say you shouldn't. And there's something going on here. Um, because I almost feel like the probability cloaks you from responsibility. Where you want to face a hypothetical when it's literally dangerous. Because one, if the bad things happen, I knew it, and then I will never have to face hypotheticals again. You're free from hypotheticals because the bad thing did happen, so it wasn't a hypothetical, it was true. So in the future, you should take all of your hypotheticals seriously and not feel bad about it. So you actually want to do it when the probability is going to make the hypothetical be true. Because then it's not a hypothetical, you know the truth, right? So you can feel comfortable as you live in fear. And and also the probability hides you from responsibility. Like, there's a way in which if things don't go well, one, you now have a sense of, I knew it, and then also I knew it and it's not my fault. So there's a double sort of disavowal that's occurring. There's some psychoanalytical move, because this is what in my experience, people don't want to face hypotheticals when they should, and they do want to, when its probability says they shouldn't. Like, there's some psychoanalytical thing going on there. Another way to put this is people want to face fears when it's wise not to. And they don't want to face fears when it's wise to. And the question is why. And I think we want to face fears when it's wise not to, because there's a way in which we want the fear to come true. We want the fear to come true because then we knew it. Well, like, the world actually makes sense. If you fear it, it's true. There's some sort of syllogism there.
I don't know.
There's some sort of equal sign that one gains.
I mean, or we, perhaps.
Please note that you couldn't know that you were doing this, because then it would destroy the entire effectiveness, because the fear coming true would not be the world disclosing itself to you. It would be you arranging the situation, and thus the result would be contrived.
Okay. It's hard for me not to hear, like, you want your fears to come true, which
I think there's a way humans do. That's why you need to face them. You need to not allow...
To let that bubble pop, basically?
Yes.
Like, to kind of...
I think fear gives a certain sense of knowing your options. Because if you're afraid to do that, then you don't do it. And it sort of creates a kind of, almost, I want to say, pod, like Raymond talks about, that you know in where you are, in where you find yourself, and where you kind of belong. Like, I think there's kind of a fox belonging, too, that can come up there.
No, I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I think there's something really important and very revealing about what you're saying.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying there's some interesting thing.
Yeah, I think there's this sort of strange self-disclosure. Like, there's this kind of... Like, the disavowal is what makes the most sense to me.
Yeah.
I think the idea... I don't know if I'm just taking it too, like, low-order causality or something. Like, too crudely or whatever to say... Because I just can't... The whole point of it being a fear is you don't want it to happen.
Sure.
You're,
but
like,
why do human beings... But there's
so
something
why would
where...
you want the fear to happen? You wouldn't.
There's... But it's this weird thing where you want to face it when it's probable that it would happen. So because in my experience, people are suddenly gung-ho to do things that they're normally not normally willing to do, when actually it would be wise not to do it. And why is that?
But don't you think that's like another angle to think about it? Though I think there's something interesting to what you were saying. Couldn't that just be because then they can let probability trump it and feel like they faced a fear?
That's all.
It's like, great. Like, I get to still have that hypothetical fear, but probability told me it's okay, because I was willing to. I was there. I was going to do it, but probabilistically, it's probably not smart for me to do that.
So it's a self-deception.
Yeah.
Because
you can kind of
people
feel
are going to stop you. So you're like, yeah, I want to do it, but others will stop me.
and
So
then
that
you can also defer your responsibility to
yeah,
them.
and because those are
I
the
think
people
that
you
that
may, but that could be a form of proving yourself too, right? Because those are the people who think you should do the thing. So if it's a situation where you know you'll be stopped, then you can kind of showcase willingness, and then if you don't go through with it, it's not your fault. So there's a kind of cake and eat it too kind of thing.
I mean, I can resonate with that more.
Sure.
At the same time, the concept of the disavowal, I think, is quite
There's probably
play in
multiple.
some ways.
I mean, there's multiple. There's not a single explanation.
No,
there
no,
are probably differences on personality.
No, and the other thing too is that though it is, I can't really concede to the statement that people want their fears to happen because
Sure.
I don't. I think
not consciously.
Not
They don't consciously.
Maybe maybe what is occurring on the unconscious is basically a focusing on that which you don't want to happen, and yet you're giving all your time and attention to that.
Well, I guess
so it's like,
maybe
it's obsessional in that way, like to the point where you should not be doing that, because if you're almost putting it above what you value or something.
Well, maybe to put meat on the bones, it's the idea that
it's like the love-hate thing. What I mean to say is I could see it more in terms of the words love-hate, like you love to hate it or
sure. Well, I guess what I would say is, in a weird way, if what you fear happens, then fears aren't fears, they're facts. There's a weird transmutation that occurs where you actually don't have to be afraid anymore because you actually that's the way of the world.
Yeah, so it's not so much that people want their fears to happen. Obviously, that's why they're deathly afraid of them.
Yes.
Or gravely afraid of them.
They want their fears not to be fears by making them facts. Instead
of just facing it and not letting it be a fear, right? Facing the fear to the point where you don't let that be a fear in your life.
Yeah.
Like it kind of makes me think about when let's just say in a movie or something like that, right? Where somebody's like their fear, or they think it happened, and then they say the expression "I knew it."
I knew it. That's what I'm getting.
I think that's getting at it very well.
Yes.
Because it's saying is that people are strangely craving of certainty.
Yes.
Even when it's the thing that they fear.
Yes, that's right.
Which could be a state of uncertainty. Like you could be thrust into a state of uncertainty, which is the very thing you fear. But then you sort of have to do this sort of like what I mean by the self-disclosure is like this thing that kind of conceals that so that you can feel certain in the uncertainty.
Yes.
And so then there's this kind of sense of, like I said, if you see it in movies, you'll see this line happen quite a bit. I knew it.
Yeah, because
and I think I think that's kind of getting at what you're talking about.
Yeah, because there's a way in which if you face the fear when it's probable that it will occur, then if it occurs, you can say I knew it, and therefore you no longer have to face fear again, because fears are just facts. So there's a way in which you're sacrificing yourself in that instant to disavow all other instances. Where if you maintain the probability possible distinction, then you have to face it every single time. Like every fear is a new challenge, right? But if you it's almost like if you make one sacrifice, then you're done. You're free. But it's a free that is well, it's kind of hell. You're locking yourself inside, right? Like Lewis says, 100%, right?
Yeah. So then it's almost more like the I think it really does have a lot to do with the element of certainty.
I think so, because in the paranoid too, there's a sort of I know it, because you're chasing everything. I know it, like a pitching novel or something. With the hypothetical, well, there's a certain of what ifness to the hypothetical. So you want to restore in the hypothetical, I knew it, in a way you can, well, if there's the possibility of the hypothetical, then there's the possibility of the loss of certainty. So how do you get rid of the hypothetical? Because in all honesty, if you're thinking in probabilities, you can always have the hypothetical creep back in and you have to rethink it and deconstruct it time and time again, right? So you kind of never get certainty. And of course, in probability, you never get certainty either, only confidence, right?
Right.
But if you can face a hypothetical when probability is on the side of the hypothetical not going well, then that's actually a trick to regain certainty or a sense of certainty, because then I knew it, right? Where you're returning to a kind of state of the paranoid, but it's not by chasing everything, but by dismissing everything. Because I knew it. These aren't fears, they're just realities, right? So I'm actually wise now never to do any of these things. You've actually collapsed the fear-wisdom distinction. Because it's just reality. These things will happen if I do it, therefore I don't, right? So it gives you a sense of knowing. So the paranoid has a sense of knowing. The person who collapses, who intentionally self-sabotages, maybe that's what we're talking about here. It's a certain self-sabotage. Because there always is the question of where does self-sabotage come from? That's something humans do, where they knowingly sabotage themselves or sabotage themselves unconsciously. There are different ways to go about it. That too creates a sense of certainty. And we've talked about that, where we like to sabotage gives us control, because we have more control over destroying a sandcastle than people liking it. Like if I want to build a sandcastle people like, that feels less in my control than building a sandcastle I destroy. Right, so sabotage creates a sense of control, right? Well, in this example of facing fear when it's probable that that's not the right time for that, there's a kind of self-sabotage there that actually saves me from having to worry about the problem of facing fear ever again, because then I knew it. I knew that these hypotheticals were not hypotheticals, that they were reality. And actually, seeing as it all went wrong this one time, it would be foolish to do it again. It would be foolish now to face that hypothetical again. So I think there's also a collapse of the fear-wisdom distinction and self-sabotage.
Well, the other thing too is it's funny how strong the hypothetical can be at play, because say with this sort of like, okay, now people seem to be ready to face fears and hypotheticals when the probability is like, then that wouldn't be smart to do that right now. And I do think you're right. It kind of reminds me how eager we are to talk when we shouldn't, and how when we should speak, it's time, you really should say the thing. You're like, I'm not saying it. So it reminds me a lot of that. But what I was going to say is that if you do take the wisdom of the probability, right, you say, okay, well, this is probably not the best time to do it, but hypothetically it could have been. You go back, the hypothetical can dominate so much to the place where you still feel like you kind of conceded in a bad way, like you didn't.
Well, the hypothetical can't have the last word,
but it often will try.
Well, by definition, rationality always tries to deconstruct. Right. Like fear is but a form of rationality. Fear is a kind of unbound rationality. It's the barbaricism of refinement. It just can ever deconstruct. That's why rationality can't have the last word, but truth, because it will always deconstruct. Likewise, a hypothetical cannot have the last word because it always deconstructs. So the moment you've assessed the probability, I mean, basically you just have to stay in probability, not even ask about hypotheticals. Because once you step into hypotheticals, it pulls you, right? So basically hypotheticals are never valid. The moment you identify a hypothetical, you should deconstruct it, right? Yeah. I guess I almost want to say, hypotheticals are possible of a human brain that can imagine. If we couldn't imagine, we couldn't create. There wouldn't be fiction, there wouldn't be stories. And if we couldn't imagine, we couldn't build a better world.
Yeah.
But where there's imagination, there's the possibility of its disordering into hypothetical. And so maybe the problem with a hypothetical is it's imagination without creation. And that's why it's a bad thing. And where probabilities are imagination in service of actuality. Like what you're trying to do is imagine the trajectory of something already in motion. Like a probability is an assessment of something already happening. A hypothetical is a consideration of something that you have no reason to think is happening or will happen, but could happen. So there's some sort of linking. There's some sort of linking of imagination and probability to actuality to determine a trajectory.
Yeah.
And there's something about the hypothetical that's possible because there is imagination, which if there was not, humans couldn't, direct themselves toward a better future. They probably couldn't cultivate virtue. Yeah. They wouldn't have beauty. They wouldn't be creative. So the key is, maybe part of this is to realize that hypotheticals are imaginations. And imagination is not bad.
Right.
But it is imagination independent of creation. Yeah. Or any sort of root actuality. Mm-hmm. And then maybe also we want to face hypotheticals when we shouldn't, because then, we disavow the responsibility of being creative as well. Because if we shouldn't really imagine things, we shouldn't do hypotheticals. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're not going to go beyond your comfort zone, you're not going to be creative, and creativity is scary. Mm-hmm. So there's also maybe some sort of disavowal of the creative act also lurking under a few layers of this as well, where we want to feel right and just following the status quo, or just following the trajectory is what is given to us, what is presented. We want to preserve our immediacy, right? And the less we do, the more we preserve our immediacy, right? Because I also don't think there seems to be a natural binding to when hypotheticals pop up. You don't tend to come up with hypotheticals when you're going to Food Lion down the street to get food, right? Hypotheticals emerge the further away they are from your immediacy, right? Like the more different they are.
The more different they are.
Right?
Things you don't typically do.
Right. So there's something about hypothetical that is trying to preserve.
Yeah. There's
some sort of preservation that is going on in hypothetical, which preservation is a kind of opposite of creativity, right? So in my mind, there's something about hypothetical that is anti-creative, where probabilities is assessing the world so that you can better navigate a world in which you could be creative, in which you could do new things, in which you could go beyond your comfort zone. So there's something also, there's something where hypotheticals prop up with difference. And I think recognizing the self-preservation, obviously a fear of death, but the self-preservation at the heart of hypotheticals could also be helpful.
Yeah. No, I think that is helpful. And I think that, I mean, that is where, though, you don't just make up random scenarios to test yourself or to prove to others, but I do think that's why there are times when it seems like taking probability into consideration, you will have to, like, as I've said before, make yourself do certain things. Because otherwise it's just in our nature not to do the difference.
Yep.
Not to do the creative, not to do the thing that is going to be out of our immediacy.
Yep. The question is, what things?
What things and when, right?
Yeah.
But that's good. That gets into the probability questions.
But then the question is probability for what? Like, for what end, right? Mm-hmm. So there's also a question of what things out of your comfort zone do you face? Because you could always just come up with a million things out of your comfort zone to face, right?
Sure. But I don't know. I do think that for the most part, those things are pretty close at hand. Like, you know the things. I don't know. I feel like for me, it's not. Those things usually just come back around. They come back around because you can't avoid them eventually. Like they're.
But then the question is, why do they come back around? What is the characteristic of the repeating thing?
Yeah.
There's something here where I almost want to say the things outside your comfort zone you face are the things that are restricting creation. Restricting creativity, that are restricting courage, that are restricting expansion of some kind, but not arbitrary expansion, but some sort of like fitted expansion. Like this is something that you really could expand into without sacrificing what is sublative, right? So then, but creativity and virtue are tied together. So there's also a question of if the things that come back around are the things that are suggesting a virtue, an opportunity for virtue, that you can't move to the next step of creative possibility until you take that step of virtue, right? Yeah. Because, as Jockin emphasizes correctly, virtue and creativity and beauty are strongly connected together, right?
Yeah. Right, and that's kind of putting it in the proper order because hypotheticals can feel very creative. Like you said, they're the imagination.
Sure. Yeah, that's like, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also a perversion of that.
It's an unbound creation.
Yeah. Whereas
it's not toward anything.
Right. Whereas when you have the agency and probability, which is the wisdom and facing fears, right? Then you do the whole. You reorder it. You properly order it.
Yeah. So that because there's something about fear that's the opposite of beauty. Like like beauty pulls up, fear pulls away. Yeah. Like fear pulls you inward.
Absolutely.
Where beauty pulls upward, right? Yeah. And there is something about fear that goes into imagination as its own end. Whereas in beauty, imagination is pulled toward the beautiful, right? Where, like, I almost want to say that hell is located in imagination. Like, hell is imagined, like a nightmare. That's how it exists, but doesn't have substance. But, and also time goes on, like, time extends oddly in dreams. So there's something about hell that is imagination without beauty, or imagination without creativity. Whereas, quote unquote, heaven is imagination with beauty or toward the beautiful.
And creativity.
Right. So then there's a part of me that that's right. So there's a part of me that wants to say the hypothetical separates imagination from beauty. The hypothetical separates imagination from creativity.
No, I think that's brilliantly said.
So then probability is a figuring out of how to bring imagination to beauty. Right? And maybe that's another question where, like, the reason why the distinction is... So I want to say that wisdom has something to do with identifying what is needed for beauty and creativity.
Right.
Whereas fear is that of which is pulling you away from them.
Right.
So it's wise to do something if it increases beauty. And it's fear if it decreases beauty. And if imagination is separated from beauty, then you're in danger. Right? The paranoid is imagination so separated from beauty that it can't even think the problem.
Yeah.
Hypotheticals is where there's still a glimmer of beauty, but you're kind of being tempted to imagine against it.
Yeah.
Where in probability, there's a certain like trying to figure out the way to beauty.
Through imagination.
Right?
Yeah.
So... And then I guess...
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I guess I want to say, too, that maybe there's an eagerness... Maybe there's an eagerness to face fear, quote-unquote, when it's probable that you shouldn't. Because then beauty's dead. And beauty can't judge you anymore. You're locked in your own world. You can't be called outside of yourself anymore. There is a way in which human beings want to get rid of beauty. Because it judges us. We don't want to face it. There's a challenge in beauty. There's a certain sort of cultivation. It's like God is Lovecraft to those who don't love him, right? So I do think there's some sort of disavowal of beauty that's lurking in the we want to face fear as a form of self-sabotage. Right. So then we feel wise in our self-enclosure. And then, as so enclosed, there's no possibility of beauty calling us out of ourselves,
right.
or creativity demanding something of us.
Right.
So I think perhaps as we come to a close, I think there's something on the question of facing fear that is asking the question, does this lead to beauty? Or does this lead to creativity? Like, is there a beauty in this? And if the answer is no, then we might just be dealing with hypotheticals. We might just be dealing with probabilities, because if you say, well, I'm not going to, let me word that. A fear you need to face is one that there's some sort of beauty in. Because if you face it, you'll get through to the beauty, right? A probability is suggesting you shouldn't do something for the sake of the beautiful. So it's saying you shouldn't drive the car in the ice, even if you're afraid to drive the car in the ice, because driving in the car in the ice could get you killed, and then you couldn't pursue the beautiful.
It's kind of a respect, because I think beauty will demand respect.
Yeah, there's something about probability and respect. That's good.
I think so. Like, I think it relates to the beauty as a qualifier for these categories.
Yes. So there's something about hypothetical that isn't respecting the beautiful. It's just its own end.
Yeah, 100%. It's
where probability is respecting the beautiful.
Yes,
it's a certain respect
yes.
for the world and respect for the beautiful.
And I say respect because it's respecting nature, right? It's power.
Yeah.
So that's not fearful. That's respect.
Yeah.
I'll tell the kids, getting, they want to go play in the snow, and it's like, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I say, and maybe it's not the right language, but I was like, it's important to respect nature.
Well, that's interesting because
you can't, I'm fine, but then 3 minutes later, you're sticking your hand in ice, and you're like, my hands are freezing. This hurts.
Well, that's interesting language, because I now want to say the hypothetical is when you don't respect yourself. There's a certain disrespect you have for your own capacity, for your own assessment, for your own ability to direct your life course.
What would the paranoid category be with relation to respect, beauty, or yourself?
There's a way in which you respect you respect yourself outside of a world.
Yeah. That's completely true.
Where in the hypothetical you don't respect yourself in the world.
Yeah.
Where in the probable you respect yourself in the world.
Yeah. I think that's great. Yeah, that's very
so
good.
The word respect is useful here.
I think it's related to beauty too.
Yes, because beauty demands respect.
Absolutely.
And if you don't respect beauty, that's on you. That's your deficit, as Jockin has said, and he's correct. Yeah. So, in a hypothetical, you don't respect yourself. And I guess the question of facing fear is you can I want to say self-respect, which can be a dangerous term depending on what you mean by it. But there's something where facing fear is a matter of self-respect. People say empowerment, and that's true. It depends on what we mean. There's something about facing fear that is a matter of self-respect, where in a hypothetical, you're dismissing yourself. 100%. Actually.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And the probability, to even think in probability means you respect yourself enough to think in probability.
Yes.
And you're doing it in order to respect the beautiful. Respect
100%.
to respect.
Right, because I think there's a very robust and necessary relationship dialectically between self-respect and and the respect of that which is beyond yourself, right? Like I said with nature, with the kids, right? Like I said, nature is something to respect because it's powerful. Doesn't mean you're powerful in your acknowledgement of that power, so that you equip yourself to be powerful within that which is beyond you.
Yeah, in the hypothetical, you're saying you're not powerful.
No, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, so then I guess in your mind, if there's a certain discrediting of your power, that is something you need to face.
Yes.
Which, of course, is an empowering act, right? So there's a discrediting of your power, and the facing of fear is a certain empowering yourself, right? You're saying, I can face this fear.
Yes.
right? So there's a respect factor that's going out through all that. But then the heuristic would be, in the hypothetical, you're not respecting yourself. Maybe you're respecting the world over yourself, but you're not respecting yourself. In probability, you're respecting yourself, you're respecting the world, but for the sake of respecting beauty. There's the respect is directed as well, kind of teleologically, right? Whereas in the hypothetical, you respect the fact that bad things can occur, but that respect is not toward the beautiful for the sake of respecting the beautiful, because it leads to a failure of yourself to respect yourself. And the only way to experience the beautiful is with self-respect. You have to be an observer. You have to perceive it. You have to have the virtue to rise up to the beautiful, right? So there's something in the hypothetical that disconnects you from the beauty by cutting you off like that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
But very interesting. I know it's late, but I think it's interesting to bring in the respect factor.
Yeah. I think the way you put that about you respect yourself out of the world in paranoia.
Yes.
You don't respect yourself in the world in hypotheticals, and then you respect yourself in the world in the probable. In the probable.
Yes, for beauty.
For beauty.
Yeah, and only the probable isn't at the expense of the beautiful.
Absolutely. In the hypothetical, it seems to be antagonistic to the beautiful.
Yes. Yes, it is.
And then
because beauty calls you out. Right. And a thing that would call you out would also always put you at risk of the things that hypotheticals are about. Because it would be drawing you into the realm in which hypotheticals manifest, are about, right?
I want to say paranoia is like, what do we say? Respect for yourself outside of the world.
Yeah.
Then it ends up being this like perversion of beauty.
You are beauty.
Yeah, exactly. It's a perversion of beauty. That's like conspiracy, etc.
Yeah, so paranoia, you are beauty, which is the greatest heresy.
Sure.
That's idolatry of the highest order.
Right. And then there's the negligence of beauty in
the hypothetical.
And then there's a respect of beauty
in the probable. That's it.
Yeah.
And then the fear-wisdom distinction can be elucidated through the hypothetical probability distinction, of which is arranged according to the beautiful. Well, for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram.
YouTube.
For the books, please visit Amazon. All purchases of the short story collection, Under the Wing.
Yep.
We very much appreciate.
Yes.
And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.